Today's episode of The Hero's Blueprint, we've got someone truly special in the building. He's an award-winning entrepreneur, creator, speaker, mentor, and he's been behind some of the most iconic brands and projects of our time. From being a part of a number of well-known successful startups, including Priceline.com, to producing Grammy and Emmy-winning work, to teaching entrepreneurship in nearly 200 countries, this guy has done it all. But what stands out even more than the resume is the way that he thinks, how he solves problems, and how deeply he cares about helping the next generation rise. He's here with us today to share the real stuff, how he starts things from scratch, how he thinks about growth, and what it actually takes to build something meaningful in this world. Please welcome the legend himself, Jeff Hoffman.
Mhm.
How you doing, Jeff?
Good, thanks, Joe.
Yeah,
Appreciate
of
that. It
course.
can only go downhill from here.
Well, the funny thing is that wasn't even a fraction of the stuff that you're actually involved in, which is the amazing part about it. So thank you for joining. Thank
For
you for
sure.
joining. Yeah, so I want to dive in here right away and just get kind of deep. When you were young and didn't know what you wanted to do yet, what was your mindset like? Were you curious? Did you ever feel lost, or were you always driven?
So, it's a good question because one of the things that I talk about is this. People always ask about habits, and I talk about this habit that I call info sponging. And info sponging is a daily habit to allow your curiosity some time to come out. Um, because as we get adults and become adults and we get into a specific field, right? Let's say you're in healthcare. You tend to be less curious about anything that isn't healthcare because that's what your company does. That's how you make a living. Um, but to answer the first part of your question, my whole life I was the one getting yelled at because we're walking into a build somewhere, and I turn and walk back. People are like, "What are you doing?" And I was the one that literally said, "There's something shiny over there, and I'm going to just go see what it is." And people are like, "Oh my God, you do not have to pick up every shiny object to see what it is." And I would sit there and think, "I know, but I can't help it." Um, so later, I was always getting yelled at because I was always curious about everything. And I thought it was a problem. Do you know that? I don't know if you remember the movie. It's in let's see, Up, the movie Up, the Disney movie. The dog. I don't know if you remember this. The
Yeah.
dog is in the mid sentence and middle of the sentence. He always goes squirrel every time, right? And everything that he's talking is squirrel, squirrel. That's what my friends do to me. Like we're talking about something and something pops up and I'm in mid sentence and I'm like, "Whoa, what is that?" And they're like, "Squirrel," right? So I get that. You can't do that all the time, but I've never been able to control it. But Joe, what I started many years ago studying my business heroes, just the world's most successful people, and I noticed a common element. All of them actually schedule a little time to pick up shiny objects. They don't do it too much, but they don't stop doing it like everybody around me was. They just schedule time and say, "I'm going to take this time off and I'm actually going to go pick up some shiny things, then I'll go back to work." And so that is a habit I developed when I noticed that if you completely lose your childlike curiosity, you won't be a great innovator. If you don't contain it at all, you won't be a great executor. You'll never get anything done. And so, somewhere in between those two, and so my advice to your listeners is schedule some time every week where you're literally just leaving your work. You're going to go pick up some shiny objects. What I mean by that is go read some stuff, look at some stuff, watch some videos, do some stuff that has nothing to do with the healthcare business you're in. That's what innovators do.
Yeah, that's absolutely gold. I love that. And you mentioned something right there, that childlike curiosity. I think that as people get older, I think a lot of times people not only lose that, but almost feel like that could be something that could hold them back, or maybe
Yes.
acting professional in a sense. And one thing I've learned from, I mean, studying people like you and many other people is that childlike curiosity is actually one of the things that everyone kind of has to keep at the forefront of their mind. Can you dive into kind of like how you maintain that as a priority in your life? How do you let like the professional sense of the world not kind of overwhelm you, or how to not fit
Yeah.
in that
So
sense?
I'll actually explain the info sponging thing I mentioned because it's something everybody listening could start doing tomorrow. And again, it's because I for a 20-year research project, that I was trying to answer the question, what are the world's most innovative people doing that everybody else isn't? Why are those people the ones we're all reading about and looking up to? They must be doing something different. And it turns out they are. And so that's what I started explaining, which is that they're not letting their childlike curiosity die. By the way, one of the days this really became clear to me was uh, I was with well, this happened with two different guys. One was Steve Wozniak when Woz and I were together, but the other one was a guy named Nolan Bushnell. And Nolan invented a little something called video games. His company was Atari. He's the guy that hired Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak for their first job. But we had just finished kind of doing a speaking event, and there was media that wanted to like take some photos of us. So they like put us in this office away from everyone and told us to wait there. By the time the photographers came back, I didn't realize that, but while Nolan and I were talking, he had disassembled this entire little electronic thing on some guy's desk. And the guy came in and he said, not knowing who Nolan was, he said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, "You took apart the whole thing on my desk." And I looked down and all the parts are laid out. And Nolan said, "Yeah, because I can't figure out how it works." Right? And I'm sitting there thinking, instead of wondering, he just took up something apart in somebody's office to try to figure out what made it work. But that's what makes him him. And Wozniak was kind of the same when I've done stuff with Woz, right? He's off distracted by something, and you're like, let's just go. Let's just go figure out how that thing works because he's not going to stop. He's not focused on the other thing. So this is what I do to keep that. Your question was, how do you keep that in your life? My info sponging, just a word I made up. Every single day, I spend, so for the first 15 minutes of your day, and if you can't do this every day, do it once a week. For those first 15 minutes, let's keep our example. You work for healthcare, your company's in healthcare. For 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's it. You do not work in your industry and you do not work for your company. So for those 15 minutes every morning before you start your healthcare day, I challenge myself to learn one new thing every day. But here's the key, Joe. One new thing that I don't need to know. Okay. It's not about healthcare. It's not about my job or my industry. And people ask me, how do you find it? The answer is just follow your curiosity. Your curiosity is driven by your gut instinct, which is driven by everything you've ever done. So respect your gut. So what I do is in those 15 minutes, I challenge myself to learn one new thing I don't know. And usually I'll read an article, right? One time I saw an article about, it was called Selling Distressed Inventory. And I'm like, I'm not actually sure I know what distressed inventory is. So I just read that day. Another day I read one that was called, how do you managing perishable commodities? I wasn't even sure what those were. So each day I read one new thing or watch a video or talk to someone. Just take 15 minutes every day to learn one new thing. At the end of it, I write down one sentence about what I learned. And and I want you to think about knowledge like puzzle pieces. Every new thing you learn, Joe, is like if I gave you I had a box of a jigsaw puzzle and I gave you one piece and I'd say, "Joe, what is this?" You'd be like, "Jeff, you gave me a blue puzzle piece. I have no idea." If I gave you two, three, you'd still say, "No idea." Some blue and green pieces. But if I gave you a new puzzle piece every day, and every morning when you got the new one, you moved all of them around on your desk to see what you could create out of them, one morning you'd call me all excited. And you would say, "Oh, Jeff, I know what this is going to be. It's going to be a castle in the Irish countryside." So what I noticed was these innovators are collecting all these bits of knowledge from every industry and around the world, and they're rearranging them in a way no one before them ever has. So let me just close by saying, every day I learn one new thing. I write down one line and I just stare at all these things to see if I can create something out of all these pieces. Quick example. Well, ours was pretty obvious. We actually created Priceline originally was a name your own price. You make a bid on an empty hotel room. So it was a reverse auction, which was a way to sell distress inventory that was perishable, right? Airplane seats perish when you close the door to the plane. Hotel rooms perish when it strikes midnight. So those concepts, but a really clear example to end this with is a guy that was reading, Travis, that was reading about the sharing economy. had nothing to do with what he was doing for a living, and wrote the one-line sentence of the sharing economy is, a lot of people have resources that they're willing to share. They don't use it all the time. And then he was reading about task-based workforces, meaning people don't always want another job, but they would another career or job, but give me a task to do and pay me, right? Then he was reading about micro payment solutions that you don't need money anymore. You can just transact on your phone using these apps. Only then did he look at the taxi business and create Uber, right? So if you were going to do it the conventional way, and all you did was study the transportation industry all day, and someone said, let's start a taxi company, what's the first thing you would do? You would go buy cars, right?
Mhm.
But if you were looking at what is the sharing economy, what are task-based workforces, what are micro payments, you would have been the one to come up with Uber, the world's biggest taxi company that no cash exchange hands, and they own zero cars. That's how infosponging works. His curiosity led him to study all these things going on in the world and combine them in a way no one had thought of before.
Yeah.
Sorry that was long, but you asked a really important question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's absolutely gold because it's a system. I use it in a different way too, but whenever I'm looking at doing something new, I'll always look at people like yourself, successful people, and look at the foundational aspects of, what they do, what are the specific things that they do to get to a certain level. And then once I see what that exactly is, then I start to ask myself, well, okay, how can I add my own taste onto this to now even bring it higher and then add that creativity aspect? But it's adding that own creativity to a system that works that can really, help bring it to a whole nother level. But
Absolutely.
when you have a when what's the first thing you do when you have like a big idea? Like how do you actually bring that to life when something comes in your head?
Okay, that's a great question. And I'm glad that you asked that because after failing, that's the important part. It's some business ideas. That's kind of how I learned the answer to your question. Most of the time, in fact, I was on this TV thing with some CEOs, and they asked the CEOs what you just asked, that great question. They said, "What do you do when you have a new idea?" All of them said, "I get my team and we go in the conference room. We go to the whiteboard." And I said, "I get my car keys and I go to the parking lot." And everyone's like, "What?" Because everybody's answer was, we go straight to the whiteboard and we start brainstorming the new idea we have. Let me just sort of tell you where I learned that, though. This was long ago. We had an idea that instead of driving to the mall to buy a new sweater, let's say, you could use this brand new thing called the internet, and you could just order it and it would come to your house. And specifically, one of our early targets was stay-at-home moms who would have to load up kids in strollers and diapers just to drive to the store to get something. And we're like, instead of all the trouble they go through, they would probably be the first ones to say, I don't want to load up all the kids. I'll just order this thing. So we created this company where people could shop virtually. Um, and we launched it and it failed. And we could see moms, right, on the site clicking around, but they weren't buying anything. And so the company was a failure that we eventually were done with. But afterwards, because we had the contact info for these people, I reached out to some of the moms and said, "Hey, I'm just trying to learn something. Can I talk to you?" And uh, one of the moms, this is a real true story, Joe. One of the moms, I said, "I noticed you were on our website, but you didn't buy anything. You were looking at the products." And she said, "I'm not going to put my credit card into your website so you and your nerd friends can go buy technology." And I said, "Well, ma'am, we can't see your credit card number." She said, "Of course you can. I'm typing it into your website." And I said, "No, but we can't see it because we use RSA 128-bit encryption." And this stay-at-home mom, by the way, everybody that works for me and all my friends know what 128-bit encryption is, all my employees. This stay-at-home mom said, "I'm sorry, I only speak English." And I said, "Well, I'm speaking English." And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "You don't know what encryption is?" Like surprised that someone didn't know that. And she said, this is a quote, she said, unless that's the way the Egyptians bury their dead, then no, I don't know what encryption is. And I said, no, that's not how Egyptians. And she said, then I have no idea what you're talking about. So there was a massive lesson learned, right? Which is that no matter how great you think your idea is, the only opinion that matters is the person you thought was going to pay you for it. And so we changed. Now I'm really answering your question. Now, the first thing I do when I have an idea after that failure is I leave the office immediately and go find people that I think are going to be the customers. I would have gone immediately, not to the whiteboard with my new idea. I would have gone out and found some stay-at-home moms and explained it to them, and they would have said, "I don't feel safe giving you a credit card number," and I would never launched. We were too early to launch that. So even during the Priceline days when we were building those companies, I spent a lot of days where I left the office and went to well, most of it was at a grocery store, but I went to a grocery store multiple times and not wearing a shirt that said Priceline or anything else. Went and talked to people, just pushing a cart in a grocery store, pretending I was shopping, and talking to these moms. They were in the grocery store during the workday because they were stay-at-home moms about their buying habits, their purchase, their budget, and engaging them in a casual conversation at the end of your supply chain of the person I actually need to take out their credit card. So that's the answer, Joe. When I have a new idea, I leave the office immediately. I go find the people I think are going to pay for this, and I talk to them at length in a non-sales mode until I'm convinced that they like the idea. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your employees think or your friends think. The only thing that matters is the person you think you're selling to, do they understand this? Do they want this? And will they pay for it?
Yeah, that's gold. You said something there too, which I think is also worth highlighting again, which is what is kind of common sense to you isn't common sense to everyone else. And I think that that becomes an issue for anyone in any industry that you're in. It's very easy because you're always around, whether it be people, employees, or coworkers, people that know everything that you know in that
Yes,
sense. And then when you're talking to people, you're almost talking to them as if they know what you're talking about too. But something as simple as, like, for me, when I mention email marketing to people, that's such a common sense thing to me. I don't ever feel like I need to explain, so I start going into it. And then
that's a
certain people are
perfect
like,
example, right?
yeah,
And it's the stuff we know that we just assume because everyone around us knows it. And I always have to tell people, quit being blinded by your own brilliance. By the
yeah.
way, interesting note, one of the people that really taught me that was I was blessed enough once to spend a day with Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart.
Mm,
And when I was asking Sam about how he knew his concept would work, when all the experts said you can't build these big box retail stores in small town America, Sam said, I didn't ask the experts, I asked the farmers. And I said, what? And Sam said, I used to change clothes and go to these little diners where these farmers were sitting and eating apple pie and just sit and talk with them. And they had no idea that I was launching a business. He said, I learned more from buying coffee for small town farmers than I did from supply chain experts on Wall Street. And that really stuck with me. Sam built Walmart by asking the people in small towns, if I built a big store here, what do you want? How do you want it to work? So I learned that lesson from him.
yeah. You also mentioned, like failure too with a couple companies as well. And for a lot of people, when they hit their first wall of failure, that can kind of be almost it for them. They feel like they can't get back up. So I'm curious for you, how do you yourself build momentum, whether it be after a company doesn't work out or maybe something personally just doesn't work out? How do you get that momentum back in track to keep going forward?
Yeah, so another good question, Joe, and I think a big part of it, in all honesty, is a DNA thing. Um, there are people always ask the question, are entrepreneurs born or made? And the answer is both, right? That the made part is what you and I are doing right now, right? It is, I've tried always to listen. Back then, there weren't podcasts, but whether it's a podcast, a book, a speech, whatever, from people who have been there and done what I'm trying to do, I try to learn from them. That's the made part. You can become better an entrepreneur by absorbing knowledge. But there's a born part, I think, which is the DNA of risk, right? Real entrepreneurs are not risk averse. In fact, typically, there's that saying, being an entrepreneur is like jumping off a cliff and trying to build an airplane on the way down. If jumping off a cliff scares you to death, just don't do it. Don't be an entrepreneur. But if jumping off the cliff into the unknown is thrilling for you, right? Some people love roller coasters, some people hate them. We are not all the same. So some people have the DNA to be an entrepreneur because the unknown excites them, and other people, the unknown scares them. So part of that DNA is your ability to shake off failure, right? Is when you fail to say, well, that hurt, that sucked, that wasn't fun, but you remain convinced that your next idea, you're like, all right, you're already forgotten that one because you're so excited about the new idea that you have. That's what entrepreneurs do. As soon as they're on to the next one, there's nobody that doesn't feel the pain of failure. It is not cool. It is not fun, and it hurts. But the people with that entrepreneurial DNA, I used to, the company I was just telling you about, I was kind of not really jokingly, but telling the team, I said, all right, we're shutting the business down Friday. It failed. I said, Saturday, you can go home and cry all day. Sunday, you can go out and drink all day or whatever you do, right? But shake it all off by Sunday night and come back Monday morning and we'll start something else. If you can't shake it off and just move on to the next, you're not an entrepreneur. Many entrepreneurs have failed and survived it, but I think probably way more people have failed and not survived it. They said, I'm just going to go back and get a job. And that's okay too, but that's just not the entrepreneurial DNA. You just have to leave it in the past. We always would do I used to tell them it's an autopsy. Let's take the dead body. Let's do an autopsy. Let's write down all the lessons we learned, like the example I just gave you. The lesson I learned was assuming my customer knew what encryption was. That was a stupid assumption. That came out of the autopsy from the dead body. Um, you take all those learnings and you just make sure when you launch your next idea, you don't repeat any of those mistakes. So there's no magic formula to keeping that momentum other than, like I said, if you have the personality type that you can get over it, you'll be a good entrepreneur. There is one other thing, though, which is a tribe. When you're really down at those low moments, you know who builds your momentum? Your tribe, meaning that you need to find some friends, some people. They might not be people that are in your family, your friend set now, but you need to connect with people who are entrepreneurs, who've been there, who have been there and done this. Because when I call and it's like, Joe, man, this is horrible. I got to shut my company down Friday. We're just not making it. And you say to me, yeah, I remember this company I had when it failed and we had to shut that down. And yet I see you now, Joe, and you're thriving and your current thing is working, right? So having a tribe of people, and I call you and you say, dude, look at me. I failed and look at me now. My next idea is doing really well. You need people to talk to who've been there and done that.
Yeah.
That helps you rebuild that momentum.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I want to build on that and ask you something else too, because you've started businesses, made music, produced movies, and I think a lot of people get kind of stuck with what we talked about earlier with the shiny object syndrome in a business sense though. How do you decide what's worth your time when everything sounds exciting or there's all these new ideas coming out?
Okay, so really important point as well, which is that because sometimes people say to me, man, you've done a lot of stuff in your career. And the one thing I always have to say immediately is yes, but not at the same time. I have never been a parallel entrepreneur. I've only ever been a serial entrepreneur. Um, you have to, and one of the people I learned that from was Richard Branson, because Virgin had, Virgin Music, right? And they had Virgin Mobile and Virgin Airlines, and now, Virgin Galactic, the space thing. Branson said to me, we've had all those companies, but I've only run as the CEO. I've only CEO'd one at a time. And once a company is up and running, I've either sold it, like he sold Virgin Mobile to Sprint. He said, or I brought somebody in, like he brought the former director of NASA in to run Galactic, to run the company, and I move on to the other one. So the important thing when you're doing this is to make sure that you are only doing one thing at a time. So at the time when we were doing hotel rooms, If you had called me and said, "Hey, I got this idea I want to tell you," I would have said, "Joe, unless your idea is how to sell more hotel rooms, call me in a year." Because that's all I'm caring about now. Later, when I was doing music, if you'd called me, I would have said, "Joe, unless you have an idea of, of how to sell out tonight's concert, call me next year." Because that's all that I'm working on. So staying focused on one thing at a time is super important. By the way, that also enables you to fail faster. Part of the answer when people say to me, "You've done a lot of stuff in your career," it's because the stuff that failed, I failed pretty fast because I was not doing any extra stuff. I was totally focused on this, so I got to the end point, excuse me, faster when it wasn't working. And so deciding what's worth your time is kind of back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. When we decided, like when we did before music, when we did film, right? When I said I would love to go through the process and learn how a movie is made. One of the things I did again was a lot of research. And I had some Friday nights outside of movie theaters just talking to moviegoers. What kind of movies do you just pretend you're waiting for a friend and you stand outside. And there's lots of people milling about outside the theater going in. And you can say, "Hey, what are you guys seeing tonight? Why'd you pick that movie? What kind of movies do you like? Why do you like those kind of movies?" By the time we were done with all that research, we concluded that the idea we had, which at that moment in time, the first movie was a scary movie, was that creating a horror movie following this formula that we learned from moviegoers was worth our time. So whether it's worth your time or not is much more of a question of, is there actually a customer for the thing that you're doing? If you're doing it for fun and you don't care about making any money, then do whatever you want. But I always tell people that's a hobby, not a business. If you're talking about a business, the only person that can tell you if it's worth your time is the customer you thought was going to pay you. Back to that again. And so we learned a lot about sort of the customers of horror flicks, because that's the first movie we made. And we were pretty sure we knew who they were. They would like this product. And it worked. That first horror flick was a movie called Cabin Fever that we made that were able to get it to open in, I think, 3,000 theaters across the US, but we sold it in about 50 countries. So the movie was commercially successful. Not that it was a good movie, it was a horror flick for 20-year-olds, but it worked because we knew the audience, and it was worth the time because we delivered a product that a lot of people in the end liked.
Yeah. Even building off that, I'm curious, how do you know when to keep going versus when to pivot or let go? Because I'm sure
Oh,
even when you were coming up with that movie, there was some maybe obstacles that you maybe came up with. How did you figure out that you were going to keep going with that rather than letting
that
go or
is
pivoting?
another great question, Joe, because the hardest problem I have now with a lot of entrepreneurs that I mentor and work with um, is getting them to let go. And you know what people tell me a lot? They say, "Well, I don't want to be a quitter," right? Everyone has this talk, and there's this, these sayings like "never ever give up," crap like that. That's all ridiculous and stupid advice. And I hear people say that, "Well, I was told, I've given this advice, never give up, keep fighting," right? And I was like, that's just stupid advice. Life is short, right? You never know what's going to happen next. There could be a 9/11, there could be a COVID. Now, you could get hit by a bus. Nothing is certain except the fact that our time on this planet is limited. So wasting it's not a good idea. And when people say, I say, "Why are you still doing this? It's not working." Their business. And they say, "Well, I don't want to be a quitter." Well, do you know what's worse than being a quote quitter? Is waking up 7 years later and realizing you should have quit 6 years ago, that you just wasted 6 years of your life because you knew all this time in your gut, this isn't really working. This business is not making me money. It's not turning out to be what I thought it was going to be. And so the question is, how do you know when to quit? So the first part of this that we want to share with all your, all your viewers is uh, that quitting is not the worst thing. Doing something for years and then realizing you should have stopped long ago is way worse than quitting. Okay. Do you know why people don't quit? Ego. Because You told all your friends, Joe. You said, man, I got this idea. It's going to be huge. I'm going to make all this money and be successful. Then it didn't work. And your friends are like, so how's your big $1 billion dream going? And people don't want to say, I was wrong. It didn't work at all. I had to shut it down. So they just say, it's going fine. And then they say, never, ever give up. And I was like, okay, so let's get past that. That's stupid advice. So how do you know when to quit? And so I learned over time this exercise that we developed that to take out a sheet of paper, you're doing this on January 1st. And on January 1st, you're taking out a sheet of paper and you're writing down on December 31st, the end of this year, you're writing down what success looks like. This will have been a good year if the following things are true. And you try to make them as quantifiable as you can. We have 12, let's say you're a B2B, we have 12 contracts signed by the end of this year. We only have 3 now. So we're going to sign 9 more contracts. We're going to generate 2 million in revenue. We're going to double the size of our sales team. We're going to whatever, as quantifiably as you can. You ask yourself, what would a successful year look like in measurable things? And you write down, if we get to December 31st and our company looks like this sheet of paper, this was a good year. And by the way, here's where I got that. Now I'm in a meeting, it's December, and I'm sitting with the founder, the entrepreneur, and the investor. And I say, so how was 2024? And simultaneously, Joe, the founder says great, and the investor says horrible. And they look at each other. I'm like, wait, aren't you in the same company? And they're like, yeah. And the investor said, I thought we were going to get way more done this year. And the founder says, I can't believe how much we did do with the funding you gave us. And I'm like, okay, clearly you had totally different expectations and you're just discussing it now. So once you define that this is what a successful year looks like on a sheet of paper, I would then take it to all stakeholders. I would show it to all my employees, say, let's be clear. This is what we need to do this year. Then I would show it to investors and any interested stakeholder, right? You can show it to spouses and significant others. Say, this is what we're trying to get done this year. Everybody agrees of what a successful year would look like. But I also started making the other side of that sheet. And I wrote down what failure looks like. And I literally wrote down, if the end of the year, our numbers, anything you can quantify, our company looks like this, then we admit we failed, and I should not have to tell you to pack up your desk. On December 31st, everybody should be packing up and calling the investor and telling them, we failed and we're not going to use your money again another year, because if you get to these numbers on December 31st, we have proven, by the way, throughout the time when you're not hitting that, you're trying to make every adjustment. But if you get to the end of the year and you fixed everything you can and your numbers still look like the failure side of the sheet, it ain't working. Go do something else, close it down, you failed. And so we agree at the beginning of the year what failure looks like. And by the way, I make everybody sign this thing. So at the end of the year, when I don't have to tell anybody, we're gonna start another company. This one failed. We shut it down. So that's my answer. Define success in writing, define failure on January 1st, and on December 31st. If you're hit the one side of the paper, keep going, and the investors should happily give you more money. And if you're at the other side, you should say, look, we all agreed that if our company looked like this on December 31st, or whatever it is, it might be 2 years from now, whatever, but you get my point, that this company's not working and we're going to shut it down. Because the worst case is to waste 3 more years and 3 times more investor money and then tell them it didn't work. You already knew it wasn't going to work. That's how we decide when to quit. We make it as quantifiable as we can in advance. And when we get there, we say, come on, guys, let's be real. It ain't working.
Yeah. That's incredible. You said something earlier too about, in a business sense, when you're working with some people, they don't want to be known as quitters, and that ego comes up. This is something I know is really prominent. I mean, I remember when I was 16, 17, 18, I didn't even know what ego was, but looking back now, I realized that my ego was out of control. what would you recommend or tell someone right now who's 18, going into college, or maybe even pivoting in college, who how can they get aware of their ego, and how could they even recognize and start to get that under control, get a head start on that?
Um, I really think it's by talking to, well, yeah, I think the big answer is get a mentor, right? And the way you pick a mentor, I wish I'd had one much earlier in life. I didn't really find someone. The way you pick a mentor, because by the way, the first time I made a mistake, I thought the mentor was somebody that knew the industry that I was in, right? So I was doing stuff in the travel industry. And so the first guy that I went to mentor, it's because he had been successful in travel and new airlines and stuff. But that was a big, valuable lesson. He was a human being that I would never want to be like. Um, and I learned a lot of what not to be when you grow up, no matter how old you are. So I learned over time that a mentor should be somebody that it doesn't matter what industry or business they were in and you're in. A mentor should be a human being that you look at and say, man, I want to be like him when I grow up. I want to be like her when I grow up. And I don't care how old you are, right? You're never done growing up. No matter how old you are, if you're looking for a mentor, it's a person you say, I want to be like that person someday. And when you find that person that you really look up to and admire as a human being, that includes their business success, but not only. That's the mistake I made. I just picked somebody who was really successful in business and wealthy, and he was a horrible human. And then later, when I found a mentor, he didn't have near the financial success of the first guy, but he taught me so much about leadership, right? That I translated into actually being a good CEO. And he taught me so much about relationships that I translated into managing customers. So when you find that person is going to tell you, and I've done this before. I told somebody last year, I said, I can't work with you. And he said, why? And I said, you can't see around your own ego. And I said, I'm wasting your time and mine trying to mentor you because you already think you know everything. So why are we wasting time here? And I told him, I said, your ego prevents you from hearing customers, prevents you from listening to your employees because you think you're the boss and they're just the employee. When in fact, I was sitting in your conference room and your team had ideas that were way better than yours and you just shut them down because you think you're so smart. I said, so go find someone else because I'm wasting my time and your time here. And it took him a while, but he kind of had a huge breakdown at one point because he was so disappointed. He's like, you're kind of my business hero and you don't even want to talk to me. And I said, yeah, maybe you should introspect a little. And then he started realizing about other people that had left his company and friends. And he finally woke up to the fact that he was the problem, not everyone else. So find a mentor and find a mentor that you admire 360, right? As a human being. And that person will help you a lot with understanding if your ego's out of check, because Joe, it's a fine line between confidence, which is a requirement, and arrogance, which is pretty much, one of the seven deadly sins. You need confidence, but when you get to arrogance and ego, you're done. You're not listening any to customers, to people, to anything anymore, and you're not going to succeed.
Yeah. That's incredible advice. And I'll share one piece that helps me a lot too
Please.
on a daily basis, which is I found myself for a very long time waiting to respond rather than really listening. And I think this comes up in a personal sense or a business sense. Is a lot of times we're waiting, we hear something that somebody says, and then we instantly have something in our head to respond with, rather than listening and understanding, okay, why are they thinking the way that they're thinking? And I notice for me myself is when I'm waiting to respond, that's ego taking over because I think I know the answer. I want to give a solution rather than truly being present and listening to what they're saying and understanding what somebody is saying and then going from there. That's one way that I identify ego in my life almost every day, which happens all the time, but that's how I can keep it under control.
I think that's a really, really good example because that gives people one that they can actually think about, right? They can think to themselves, do I do that? Am I listening to the person or am I just waiting for them to stop so I can say what I wanted to say anyway? I think that's a good example of when your ego is pushing you too hard.
Yeah. Another thing from our mutual friend, Melter, which is, be more interested than interesting.
Yes.
That's a huge, I try living by that motto every single day as well.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
So
And like you're talking about with Dave, with Meltzer, he'll tell you his story that his ego ruined his life, right? And he had to reboot his entire life when he realized that he was the problem. So I think Dave vulnerably tells his story really, really well.
yeah, no, I agree. So Jeff, I'm curious, what are some things that you do consistently, even when nobody's watching, that you think makes the biggest difference in your own personal success?
Um, well, we talked about one of them, which is the info sponging. I try to keep learning, be a lifelong learner and never think you're never as smart as you think you are. So never stop learning. Because that's one I do on my own, right? You said kind of the when no one's looking. I think the other one would be um just being more engaged in the world around you, right? So when you're being more curious about a lot of different things, go more places, meet more people. I have a tendency, if I'm by myself, I'm not in work, but I might be in the grocery store and I'm standing in line, I just start talking to the person in line in front of me and learning their story. Every chance you get to get more engaged in the real world, right? Off the couch and out of your office. I always tell people amazing doesn't happen on the couch at your house. Amazing happens in the world. So if you're not spending enough time in it, especially in a day and age, obviously it's super powerful that we have the whole internet in our hand on our phone. Uh, but there's a whole layer of learning that you don't get until you put the phone down, go outside, and go meet and talk to human beings. So for me, it's making sure that I am engaged in the world enough. That's what I tell people. Sometimes when people see some of the things that, that I get to do in my life, they're like, "Man, you're so lucky." And I always tell them, it's not really that I'm lucky, it's that I'm engaged. I go a lot of places. I talk to a lot of people. I try a lot of things, many of which fail, but I'm out there engaged in the world and the people a lot. And when you do that, you're much more likely to stumble upon life-changing moments and life-changing people. Never happens when you're sitting at home on the couch. So for anybody listening, I want you to answer that question. Do you schedule time to just put everything down and to actually go out into the world and engage, to go somewhere new, to meet someone new? Make sure that you scheduled that on your calendar to have more time to do that.
Yeah. I want to ask you a follow-up question to that right there. When you have a couple different ideas on coming up in your head, how do you differentiate between a good idea and the right idea for you?
So part of it we already covered, which is you don't. You go out and ask the stay-at-home mom because the idea is for her. Um, so you let the market tell you. So I won't repeat that because we already covered that. But there is another thing that I always look at that you should ask yourself. Of all the ideas you have, where do you have the most, quote, unfair advantages? And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. Early on, when we were, well, let me back up. Way before Priceline, one of the first products I built was when you go to an airport and you check yourself in at a flight, the check-in kiosks that are in the airport, right? You go get your own boarding pass. That was one of the first products we created. Um, and so early on, I was delivering value to airlines, right? And saving them millions of dollars with technology that we were building, among other products. And so to build those, we had to learn the sort of back end programming language of all the airline systems, which was undocumented and unteachable for security reasons. So we had to reverse engineer it and learn it ourselves, which was extremely difficult. Um, and then to sell these products, we had to build relationships with all the top people at the airline. So now, set that aside. Now we have a bunch of things people are calling about, things that we could go do. And the guy who had the original idea for Priceline, a guy named Jay, um, Jay called and reached out to me and said, "Let's build this thing." He said, "Come here. I have this idea. Let's go." And he had the patent on the reverse auction to start Priceline. Anyway, I'm looking at different things that I could be doing. And so I'm asking the question I just said, where of all the ideas you have, which ones you have the most advantages on? And so when I was telling people what we were going to build at Priceline, there were people that would tell me, man, don't just tell everybody your idea. And I said, why? They said, they'll steal it. I said, good luck with that. You know why? Because it took our team like the better part of 2 years to learn the coding language. And if I pick up the phone and call the CEOs of a lot of the airlines, they actually take my call. And I was like, good luck, Joe. Call the airline and say, put me on the phone with the CEO and see how well that goes. So in that space, we had a lot of advantages. We knew the code. I knew people that had worked in the space. We had relationships and good relationships with all the paying customers. So of all the things I could do, that's the one I'm probably going to do best at because I have the most advantages. So that's my answer to your question. Look to see. I had a guy come into my office one time, and he only had a drawing. I said, "What's this?" He said, "I'm in a medical device." And I said, "Are you a doctor?" He said, "No." I said, "Oh, well, you work in the healthcare field?" He said, "No." And I said, "You built medical technology in the past?" And he said, "No." I said, "You know people in this field?" And he said, "No." I said, "What am I missing?" He said, "I just think if I could create this thing, the medical field would want to buy it." And I was like, "But you don't know anything about medical technology. You've never built a medical device. You don't know anyone that has. You don't know any potential employees you could hire because you never worked in the space, right? And you don't have any relationships with hospitals and doctors." And he said, "Right." And I said, "What are some of your other ideas?" Right? And his other ideas, you could answer yes to all those questions. I was like, why would you pick the one that you have the least chance of succeeding in? So that's the opposite example of that. I'm like, I don't even get it. And he said, I just thought up this idea and I want to try it. And I was like, well, you should pick, when he told me his other ideas, you should pick an idea where you have some advantages.
I
Or
think that's
someone, by the way, when I say you, Joe, that can be someone on the team, right? My co-founder is a surgeon. That would have worked. And he has all those relationships. It doesn't have to be you, but your company has to have some reason to believe you can pull this off.
yeah. I think that's so powerful. Hearing from people directly on what they want, talking to the customers first, and then also combining what you just said right there. I think that's powerhouse of things right there that people can do. I'm curious personally, myself, what is your current definition of success for you?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. Uh,
Yeah, that's what I wanted to follow up on, and how has it changed over the years?
yeah, because initially, we were we are sort of trained to believe that success is kind of a combination of a couple of things. Is really kind of based on like things like money and fame. Everyone's trying to get internet famous. Everyone's trying to do the unicorn, the billion-dollar company, whatever. And so, excuse me, that's what we're raised to believe. And yet, I have literally, Joe, billionaire friends who are miserable, and I have very famous friends who are miserable. Right? We live in a world where, Robin Williams commits suicide, Anthony Bourdain committed suicide. These are rich and famous people. Kate Spade. Um, so clearly, it's not just are you rich or are you famous. And then the flip side of that, my best friend, Michael, who had no fame and no money, no power, was one of the happiest, most well-adjusted sort of people I've ever met in my life. Unfortunately, he died in an accident. But he had none of those things and he was way happier every day. So it made me think about what does success really mean? And as a matter of fact, Success in the City is the name of the streaming show that we won. We just won our second Emmy award for because we created some content to address this issue. What does success really look like? And so I redefined the definition because of Michael and because of all these other people. And remember the mentor I told you at the beginning that was the human being that I didn't want to be like? He wound up all alone in his castle and miserable. He had a castle because he made so much money. He was rich and he was super in his industry famous. and he wound up alone in a castle because nobody wanted to be around this guy anymore, and he was miserable. So, because he was succeed at any cost. And so he traded away his own family and all his relationships just to get rich. Um, and I saw that lesson. And I was like, wow, that cannot be the answer to success. He's was the richest guy I knew at the time and the most miserable at the same time. So success for me now is the definition is the answer is this. Um, is just are you happy with your life? Can you look at your life, and including all the mistakes you've made, and look back and say, you know what, this has been a pretty good ride. I wouldn't change anything. That's all success is. You might be rich, you might be famous, but you might not. The answer is, though, when you look at your life, will you nod and say, I'm actually using this is a pretty good ride. I'm using my time pretty well, because that was Michael's thing, my friend. He loved his life. He didn't want to be someone else. If you said, hey, do you want to swap places with this billionaire guy I told you about? He would have said, no, I'm good. I'll keep my life. And other people were like, you wouldn't want all his money? And he'd be like, I don't want all his unhappiness. I like my life. I like the people in it. I like what I do. So success is just you being honest enough to look back at your life as of right now and nod and say, it's going pretty good. I am happy with the way my life turned out, and I don't want to be someone else.
Yeah.
You're
That's
responsible for you, and quit judging yourself by other people's standards or worrying about what they're doing.
That's incredibly valuable advice because I know there's somebody listening right now who's going day by day living a miserable life because they're chasing a definition
Yeah.
of success that they think is going to one day make up for it all. And I hope that they just sit with what you just said there for a second. It's like, people that billions of dollars super miserable. It's like, are you really chasing something that you're gonna be proud of at the end of the day and be happy that you did? Because when I tell people my story too, it's like I gave up relationships, I let relationships die. I gave up a bunch of stuff chasing what I thought I wanted. And then I realized after chasing that for so long, when I started getting some money, I was like, you know what? I care more about the people that I haven't talked to in 3 years than this money now. And I thought it was
Exactly.
the reverse. So I really hope somebody sits with that and really kind of defines success and start to kind of use it as their guideline in life and say, am I on that trajectory, going towards like what I think is most important to me at the end of the day?
Exactly. And that doesn't mean it can include money, but if that's your
Yeah.
first priority, you're gonna trade away things like your relationships that you wish you never. You'll be doing what this guy I told you about. You'll be alone in your castle, wishing you
Yeah.
had somebody to celebrate with. That's literally what happened to him. He called me in the middle of the night once, said, "Will you come over?" And I didn't want anything to do with him. I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm kind of lonely." And is everybody he cared about had left him because he traded them for financial success,
Yeah.
and he was miserable.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Jeff, I want to be respectful of your time, so
Yep.
I want to ask one more
All
question.
right.
If today was your last day on earth and you could leave behind three things that the future generation will be able to come to whenever they're going through times of trouble or they just need some guidance, what would those three things kind of be to be their compass?
Well, the biggest one, I just came back from Africa, spending time with all the children that we're raising in Africa. We raise abandoned children. Um, I think the biggest one is uh, focus more on impact than on anything else. If you're judging yourself by the number of dollars you made, that's a pretty empty endpoint. If you're judging yourself by the number of other people's lives you made better, it just changes the level of fulfillment you have, right? When I leave these kids, um, who we're raising and helping them get to a better life, it changes the way I feel about the entire everything I've ever done, including the bad parts of my life. You sit there and you look at these kids and you're like, it was all worth it just to get me to a place where I could help somebody else get to a better life. So focus on impact, because that will, again, that overrides all, it makes everything worth it. Um, I think that's one. Two, you already covered, but let's say it again, which is it's all about people, and it's all about relationships, and the most valuable currency you'll ever have is relationships, not money. They can take the money, they can take the houses, they can take the cars, but if you have strong relationships with people you care about and care about you, you could actually survive losing all that stuff. In fact, David, we mentioned him earlier, literally did, right? Um, and then the guy, I'm obviously not going to mention his name. The other guy I've been talking about didn't. Um, he did not, in fact, survive uh, losing everyone and everything. So remember that it's all about the people around you and the relationships, and take better care of them than you do of money. And you said a third thing. um, I guess probably the third thing would be that there's something worse in life. Don't fear failure. There's something worse in life than failing, and fear not trying. If I had spent my whole life if I had not tried to make a movie, because believe me, Joe, everybody told me, Jeff, you're a software engineer. What are you doing? You can't make a movie. If I had listened to those people, I would have spent, if you go and you try to make a movie and you fail miserably, you can say, oh, well, it wasn't for me. Obviously, I'm not a movie maker. But if you never try because you fear failure, every time you go in a movie theater the rest of your life, you're going to sit there and say, I wonder if this could have been me. A failure you can get over. Not trying will sit in your gut the whole rest of your life. So don't fear failure. Fear not trying, and be bold enough to go try stuff, and be strong enough when you fail. Everybody's going to laugh at you. I did when I failed. People are like, oh, Jeff, you thought you were so smart. They're going to make fun of you. Get over it and keep going. Because if I had stopped when people did that, we never would have, we never would have wound up winning those Emmy Awards. Or one day when I started the music company that everyone told me not to do, if I'd listened to all them for fear of failure, I wound up standing on the red carpet one day at the Grammys, because we won a Grammy. And I'm standing there for real on the red carpet at the Grammys thinking, man, if I'd listened to everybody else, I would have never had this feeling right now. Go out, try things, fail, get over it, and try something else. Joe, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, mic drop moment right there too. And for all the listeners that are tuned in right now, how can they get involved with what you're doing? Where can they find you at or best support you?
Sure. I'm most active probably on LinkedIn. My Instagram is Speaker Jeff Hoffman. I do have a website, jeffhoffman.com. And then last, I mentioned the children. Sometimes people say, how can I help? If you want to help, don't help me. Help us help these children. And that's called World Youth Horizons. And it's worldyouthhorizons.com. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can help us raise abandoned children around the world.
Awesome. I'll have all that in the show notes. But thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on here and dropping all this wisdom. I know it's going to impact some lives and hopefully change the trajectory of some at minimum.
Thank you, my friend.